I did not get the option to edit. I think the host.
All of you, you are welcome to this webinar today, 11th of March, Tuesday, 2 p.m. in South African time. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on the region you are following us from. I'm Adriano Novunga. I'm the ED of the Center for Democracy and Human Rights here in Mozambique. I will be the host of this webinar today on the truth and accountability for post-election human rights violations in Mozambique. The focus is on the transitional justice as a pathway for justice, reconciliation, and institutional reform. As you know, following the October 2024 elections, Mozambique witnessed widespread human rights violations, including excessive use of force against protesters, arbitrary arrests, and extrajudicial killings. Between October 2024 and January 2025, over 600 death alerts were recorded, with 348 civilian deaths confirmed through rigorous verification process. Reports of mass graves in Zambezia province and Nampula have been further received as an alert, which highlighted the urgent need for a thorough investigation and accountability. Also suggests the existence of death squads allegedly organized by the state to target and eliminate human rights defenders and pro-democracy activists. However, violence was not solely state-driven. Non-state actors also engaged in violent acts, leading to death of police officers and innocent civilians. Over these 3 months, Mozambique experienced a severe breakdown in the rule of law, which continues in many parts of the country as targeted assassinations of democracy defenders and protesters persist. Given the scale of these violations, this webinar today will serve as a platform for dialogue on transitional justice. The discussion will be centered on the urgent need for an establishment of a Truth and Accountability Commission on human rights abuses and violations, which will be a critical mechanism to document abuses, ensure accountability, and drive meaningful institutional reforms in Mozambique. For this discussion today, ladies and gentlemen, my friends, we will be have as speakers Honorable Halis Mohwe, who is the president of the International Federation for Human Rights and the executive director of Tintswanelo from Botswana. We will have Dzika Maibere, who is the national director for Zimbabwe Human Rights Association. Zenalda Machado, Human Rights Watch, focusing on Mozambique and Angola. We'll have Anna Moyo, the executive director for the Center for Study of Violence and Reconciliation. We'll also have Dr. John Ikubaji from the African Union's Department of Political Affairs, Peace and Security. Professor Tim Mriti, who is the head of peace-building interventions at IGR, will also honor us with his presence. Dear friends and colleagues, this webinar today, it will be conducted in English. You know, Mozambique is a Portuguese-speaking country, so we will have a simultaneous interpretation from Portuguese to English and vice versa. To start with, we will have the initial remarks by our panelists today, and then we will have an opening Q&A session where our panelists will take questions, some from myself and also from our distinguished participants today. Without further ado, I will invite Honorable Alice Mowe, the President of the International Federation for Human Rights and Director of Dintswanelo, to give the opening remarks today. Honorable Alice Mowe. I hope she's there. Honorable Alice Mowe. Ela não está ainda. Okay, okay, so I received information that Honorable Alice Mowe has joined us for the opening remarks. Over to you, my sister, Honorable Alice Mowe. Okay. While she's preparing to give the opening remarks, I'd like to remind those who have just joined that this webinar today is on truth and accountability for post-election human rights violations in Mozambique, focusing on the transitional justice as a pathway for justice, reconciliation, and institutional reform in Mozambique. Much needed post-election violence, justice, but first of all, truth. As you know, in contexts of crisis, truth is the first victim. So the call is for a truth and accountability commission that could, through the framework of transitional justice, ensure that there is justice for the victims, there is reconciliation through dialogue, and there is institutional reform, so that this that happened in these past 3 months will not happen again. This has happened in other parts of Africa, other parts of the global south, including the global north. They have not only engaged in documenting what happened, they have ensured that there was accountability, and most importantly, taken the necessary reforms so that the nation could say, this will never happen again. Sister Alice Mowe, for the opening remarks. Over to you.
Adriana, can you hear me?
Loud and clear, my sister.
Thank you. I've been having problems with the internet. Dear participants, on behalf of the organizing team, it is our honor to welcome you to this timely and critical webinar on truth and accountability for post-election human rights violations in Mozambique. Transitional justice is a pathway to justice, reconciliation, and institutional reform. Mozambique, as you've heard, has faced an alarming surge in human rights violations following the October 2024 elections. Reports of excessive force against protesters, arbitrary arrests, extrajudicial killings, and mass graves have raised urgent concerns about accountability and justice. With over 600 reported deaths and ongoing targeted violence against democracy defenders, it's imperative that we discuss concrete mechanisms to address these violations, uphold the rule of law, and ultimately have sustainable peace building for the people of Mozambique. This webinar brings together human rights experts, legal practitioners, policymakers, as well as civil society actors to explore transitional justice as a solution to bring accountability, truth-seeking, and institutional reform. Through today's discussions, We aim to advocate for the establishment of a Truth and Accountability Commission on Human Rights. This is a key step towards ensuring justice for victims, for preventing future violations, as well as for strengthening governance in Mozambique. We thank each and every one of you for joining us in this vital conversation. Your voices, your insights, as well as your collective commitment will help shape the path forward towards justice, reconciliation, as well as meaningful change. Let us engage, reflect, and work together for a more just, accountable, and peaceful future. Welcome to the webinar. Obrigada and obrigado. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sister Alice. Thank you very much. Indeed, this webinar, it aims at calling for the establishment of the Truth and Accountability Commission so that the victims can see justice and that the country can restore the needed trust. But that is only possible if there is openness, there is transparency, there is transparent dialogue, there is accountability, which only that it can lead to the necessary reforms so that this will never happen again. I wish to invite Zenalda Machado to take us through for what happened in Mozambique. My question to you, Zenalda, is, from your advantage viewpoint, what happened in Mozambique in the October, November, December, and mid-January month? Many people are saying that the level of violence during that period, it was unprecedented. What can you tell us?
Thank you so much, Adrian. It is as if you had guessed that how I was going to start this presentation. Good afternoon, everybody. My simple answer to your first question is that I don't think it is unprecedented. It's probably happened in a context where there is a lot of social media and involvement of the youth. And you know, the youth can be vibrant, can be very creative, come up with different ways of exposing abuses. And the reason why I say it's not a precedent, or it's because for us, Rights Watch, we have been documenting those abuses for quite some time. In 2018, we published a report in January 2018 in which we called out the Mozambican government for failing to hold anyone to account for serious by both state security forces and the opposition RENAMO in the year prior to December 2016 ceasefire. You will remember that after the 2014 elections, we had a serious armed conflict in the central part of Mozambique. And we documented them abuses between November 2015 and December 2016 in a 65-page report. If you have time, please go to our website and have a chance to read this report. The title of the report is "The Next Time to Die: State Security Forces and RENAMO Abuses in Mozambique." A lot of people died in that conflict. A lot of people died. There was a lot of destruction as well, but Gorongosa is a remote area outside the spotlight of media, outside the spotlight of social media. So we have forgotten what happened in Gorongosa. But let me remind you what happened in Gorongosa. There were abuses such as enforced disappearances, executions, arbitrary detentions, destruction of private property by government forces, political killings, attacks on public transport, looting of health clinics by a political party armed group. That time we warned that the impunity for those grave abuses that, by the way, is long prevalent in Mozambique, would encourage future abuses. Well, that conflict ended with a peace deal that contained what I usually want to remind people, that it was just a one-page blank amnesty, I think 3 paragraphs, that says everybody that was involved in abuse and crimes during those periods had been given amnesty. And that was it. Now, moving fast forward 2024 to 2025, we are seeing, again, security forces, political players continue to engage in abuses with impunity. So we were right about the lack of accountability being also a source for future abuses. Before the October elections, we also warned that the Mozambican police had committed widespread abuse against journalists and civil society activists that could seriously impair their work ahead of the elections that were scheduled for October 9th. And that was important to warn them, because when journalists and civil society are unable to operate in a space that is free, it also gives space for the abusers to enjoy impunity, because there's nobody to monitor their activities. The abuses that we documented, the complaints of harassment, threats, physical assault, arbitrary arrest and detention targeting those covering election activities were ignored by authorities, even in the cases where the victims themselves went to police station and opened a formal complaint. Now, coming up to after elections, we are seeing the same type of abuses once again. Allegations of executions of opposition supporters. Every day we get information of somebody that was linked to Podemos or linked to the movement that is led by Venancio Mondlane being targeted by armed men that we are yet to know at this stage who these armed men, but many have suspected that they are linked to the security forces. We have also seen unlawful killings and excessive use of force, particularly during protests, which is not supposed to happen, because peaceful protest is a right defended in a constitution. You rightly say that over 300 people were killed, over 700 were injured by security forces who disproportionately used lethal force or inappropriately used less lethal force, such as, for example, tear gas. I think it's important at this stage to remind people that the way the Mozambican security forces inappropriately use less lethal force is becoming an embarrassment to the whole world. Everybody watches the video of security forces mishandling gas, laughs, it looks like a joke. It is something that the Mozambican government should seriously take into consideration and begin to think ways to reform security forces and make sure that they know how to use the weapons that are given to them. And it's also important to make sure that they adhere by basic principles that Mozambique is signatory of. For example, the United Nations basic principles of the use of force and firearms by law enforcement, the African Commission on Human Rights and People's Rights guidelines for the policing of assemblies, law enforcement officials, and another international standards that provide that security forces should use the minimum necessary force at all times. Non-violent means should be used before resorting to use of force and firearms. Law enforcement officers may only intentionally make lethal use of firearms when strictly unavoidable to protect life. It's also important to remind that the United Nations Human Rights Committee states that firearms are not an appropriate tool for the policing of assemblies. They must never be used simply to disperse an assembly. And any use of firearms by law enforcement officials in the context of assemblies must be limited to targeted individuals in circumstances in which it is strictly necessary to confront an imminent threat or death or serious injury. In the case of Mozambique, that's not what is happening. The use of real bullets, the use of tear gas seems to be a primary resource by security forces. Another human rights violation that became very common in Mozambique after the elections was internet restrictions. I think many Mozambicans then only heard of it in other places. Now, finally, it had come to Mozambique for such a long period of time. And internet restrictions violate multiple rights, including access to information, freedom of speech, freedom of peaceful protest. And of course, we documented that it also affects people's ability to earn a living through online business. In the context of a country like Mozambique, where there's no jobs provided by the state, a lot of people is in the informal sector. Many people are doing online business. Those weeks in which the government imposed internet restrictions, people were unable to earn a living for themselves. And of course, we also have to remember that internet providers committed themselves a serious human rights abuse by not adhering by the UN guiding principles on business and human rights and avoiding complicity in human rights abuses. I also wanted to mention the illegal arrests and detentions. We documented the arbitrary detentions for several days of children that were caught during protests, and those children were kept with security forces without notifying the families. We spoke to several parents that were panicking that their children disappeared for days, only to find out that they were somewhere in a cell, in a police station, together with several other people, including other adults. The Mozambican Bar Association reported on November that it had secured the release of over 2,700 people detained throughout the country for participating in post-election demonstrations. A significant number of those detainees were children and adolescents. But I also wanted to mention abuses that were supported by opposition. And those were mainly during opposition-led violent protests, where people engaged in mass destruction of private property without accountability, with impunity in many cases, under the watch of security forces. But it's also alarming the number of attacks and intimidations that are happening against those who refuse to join protests or refuse to follow protest actions. Same applies to online harassment, to those, for example, like me or like Adriano, like other activists that publicly criticize some of the actions of the protest movement. Before I finish, and I know I'm already running out of my time, I just wanted to leave some recommendations to the Mozambican government that they launch an investigation into the conduct of the security forces and bring those responsible for the violence to justice, and provide, as soon as possible, some redress to the victims. Again, I want to remind people about what happened in Gorongosa. People after the Gorongosa conflict, while parts that were belligerent were signing peace deals, signing warranties of survival, the amnesties, the communities that were largely affected by the conflict had to reorganize their lives again without any support from the society. Today, I still speak to women that had their husbands enforced disappeared, and they don't know till where their husbands are, if they were killed, where they were buried. And that is why it is important, for example, to establish a commission of reconciliation, because it will allow those people to express themselves, and it will allow other members of community to help them to identify the burial sites of their family members, to ask for forgiveness, and so and other things that the Commission of Reconciliation allows it to happen. But I also wanted to encourage the Mozambican government to consider requesting regional support in case it's struggling internally to find the expertise to do those things, either in a form of fact-finding mission, for example, or also in experts that can support the country in setting up a commission of inquiry and reconciliation. Another recommendation is to the new authorities of the country to publicly condemn police use of excessive force. It has become a norm. We saw police using excessive force last week. Today, as we speak, there is the hearing of the protest leaders at the State Prosecutor's Office, and we are already getting reports of how security forces deployed there are misusing tear gas. Another recommendation is to immediately release those who are jailed for participating in peaceful protests. We also would like to ask the government to identify those who engaged in peaceful protests, in attacks, destruction of properties, harassment, intimidation, and prosecute them according to the law. To respect people's rights to peaceful protest, to create mechanisms of engagement, especially with the youth, let the youth be able to feel part of this society, to immediately engage in reforms of the justice system to ensure that citizens can trust those institutions to air their grievances, but also to engage in reform of electoral bodies to avoid conflicts in the future. To protest leaders, we also have some recommendations. One is to respect the right to peaceful protest and ensure that those who don't want to protest also have their rights respected and protected. To publicly call off members of the movement who engage in intimidation, harassment, and attacks on those who disagree with them. And finally, to the international community, we want to ask them to support Mozambique efforts to reform security forces, the justice system, and the electoral bodies, to put pressure on the government to ensure accountability for abuses and support regional fact-finding mission, support civil society efforts to create mechanisms of grievance and participation for citizens, and of course, consider not only supporting but also funding a process of reconciliation that Mozambique so much needs. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Zenalda, for those initial remarks, including clear recommendations for the Mozambique government, including seeking support from the region, region being SADC, but also the African Union, which has a specialized unit in peace building, but more importantly, in transitional justice. And we see advantage here to take those recommendations as they can lead to some form of not only justice, but also, and importantly, to start some form of dialogue. The government has signed a memorandum of understanding with political parties with seat in parliament, including in local government, but it is not viewed as the right space to bring about justice, to bring about the dialogue which is much needed, and more importantly, the reform that would lead into the transformation so that this will never happen again. So we think that this space, it can shed some light on how the nation can leverage on different players, stakeholders, mechanisms to take a step forward. But let me invite Zika Maibere. Zika Maibere is a Zimbabwean national expert on transitional justice. He is the director of the ZimRight. He will, and other colleagues, unpack the transitional justice, its relevance for Mozambique. My question to you, Ber, is what is transitional justice? The audience can have an understanding and appreciation to this concept and how relevant it is for Mozambique. Zika Maibere, tell us, what is transitional justice?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Prof. And thanks to my colleagues who spoke earlier on. And when I heard you, Prof, go through the profiles of the people on this panel, I started to feel very irrelevant, because the work of these comrades that I see on the panel is the work that I have been reading, the work that shaped me as an activist. And I have no doubt that they will do justice to this question. What I will simply do is to give a brief overview just to get us going on this concept of transitional justice. Perhaps, Prof, the best place to begin in having this conversation on transitional justice is the AU theme of the year 2025, which was launched at the recently held African Union Summit. The theme reads, "Justice for Africans and people of African descent through reparations." Justice for Africans and people of African descent through reparations. I think that's a good place to begin, so that we are rooted within the African value system as established by the African Union. And as I was following the proceedings at the summit, what was very clear to me was the paradox of African leaders demanding or calling for justice for Africans within a context where their own citizens are continually experiencing injustice at the hands of their governments, either through commission or omission. And I think an opportunity for a conversation like this is an opportunity to mobilize African thought leadership around comprehensive appreciation of transitional justice, not as something that we can only demand from outsiders, those who colonize us, but something that we can grow and cultivate to become a culture in our daily living. So that is a good place to begin for us. But transitional justice within our context and the African context, I think the best definition for us comes from the African Union Transitional Justice Policy, which was adopted by the member states. I choose this definition because I think there is good consensus, including buy-in from African governments. So this policy says transitional justice refers to the various formal and traditional or non-formal policy measures and institutional mechanisms that societies, through an inclusive consultative process, adopt in order to overcome past violations, divisions, and inequalities, and to create conditions for both security and democratic and socio-economic transformation. The policy goes on to say transitional justice is meant to assist societies with legacies of violent conflicts and systemic or gross violations of human rights and people's rights in their effort to achieve transitional justice to the future of justice, equality, and dignity. The policy says going beyond retribution and drawing on traditional justice approaches, emphasizing conciliation, community participation and restitution, the concept of transitional justice advanced in this policy, which is the AU policy, seeks to address African concerns on violent conflicts and impunity through a holistic policy that considers the particular context and cultural nuances of the affected societies, as well as the gender, generational, ethno-cultural, socio-economic, and development dimensions of both peace and justice. So why is this definition important to us? This definition is important to us because over a long period of time, authoritarian African regimes have treated transitional justice as a foreign concept. Back in 2000 and 2003, around the time of the Johannesburg Symposium on Transitional Justice in Zimbabwe, it was easy to scapegoat on the West. We moved into around 2008 when here in Zimbabwe, we launched the Taking Transitional Justice to the People program. And again, the stigmatization of the work that we were doing in terms of conscientizing communities was that this is a Western agenda. And the beauty of the African Union Transitional Justice Policy framework is that it's been adopted by African Union members. So it means it can never be deemed to be a Western concept. In any case, here in Southern Africa, the closest roots that we have to transitional justice is here in South Africa, where Mandela instituted a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And it is a commission that has given so many lessons to the world in terms of transitional justice. In fact, the global explosion of transitional justice borrowed a lot from South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So it's very important, Prof, that we set transitional justice as an African concept, as an African tool for advancing justice and equality. So it comes to us as a basket of measures. So transitional justice does not simply refer to a single issue. It's a basket of measures, a toolbox, if you want to say, that is available to communities that are on a journey from a violent legacy to create a future of sustainable peace and justice. And in this basket, we find many things. Some of the things that commonly feature in this basket are truth-seeking processes. Of course, when there are massive human rights violations, before you begin talking about what to do with those violations, you want to answer the question of what and how. What exactly happened and how did it happen? The United Nations now acknowledges the right of communities, individuals, and societies to the truth about human rights violations. So it is under that particular principle, others would call them pillars, but pillars are rigid, hey? So I prefer to call them principles, because in this basket, you need to be able to move around with different tools according to the context that we have. So truth-seeking becomes an important process of truth recovery so that we understand exactly what we are dealing with. If a society was a patient suffering an ailment called violence and they visit a physician, the first thing that they would need to do is to take the temperature, to take the weight. That process is called diagnosis, to understand what exactly is happening in this person. So that is a truth-seeking process, and it's very important when it comes to transitional justice that we answer the question of what, how, who, and why. What exactly happened and who did what? How did they do it and why did they do it? And once we have that truth, and other communities use truth commissions, but there are many ways of arriving at truth-seeking. Once that happens, the next question is, how do we make it right? Which is an accountability process. So traditionally, when transitional justice had just started, the term that was used was prosecutions. But then it was felt, and even if you go through the African Transitional Justice Policy, that simply looking at prosecutions is a narrow-minded approach to transitional justice. You are simply looking at being adversarial. So the term that we now use is accountability, which is a term that looks to say, now that we know what happened from various truth-seeking mechanisms, what are the accountability approaches that we can deploy? And from the definition that I spoke about, there are also some traditional approaches to accountability, as opposed to merely thinking of prosecution. And we know that many times when you use the term prosecution, it can appear as very threatening, particularly to one party that is mainly accused of violations. The second principle are reparations. We know that violence damages societies. They are physical, emotional, and non-physical effects of violence. And we cannot achieve justice without repairing the damage. So that then brings us to the principle of reparations. In reparations, we don't seek to fully compensate or return to where things were in the beginning, because how do you compensate for a dead mother? You cannot. As a result, in many processes, these are merely symbolic, seeking to show a society's gesture and commitment to repairing the damage. And then that then is followed by reconciliation processes. If the goal is to build a peaceful community, we know that we cannot continue as we were before. So there is need for trauma healing and processes that reconcile societies so that we make violence non-likely in the future. But it's not enough to do reconciliation without putting in place measures to ensure non-recurrence. We want to be able to say never again. So that's then brings in the issue around things like institutional reform. How do we reform institutions that were traditionally deployed for violence, like the security sector institutions, the police, military, the paramilitary groups that have been deployed to decimate society so that they do not repeat that. So those are some of the principles that constitute transitional justice. And let me highlight something that comes from the Transitional Justice Policy Forum. The question of transition from what? Many times people mistake the transition in transitional justice to mean regime change, but it's actually transition from a legacy of violence to a society of peace, justice, and democratic order. And I'm taking this exactly from the AUTJ policy, which I think has been widely accepted in our continent. Let me conclude, Prof, by recommending the 5 things that I think can be done from now as we advance this conversation so that we realize transitional justice. The first thing is community-driven national conversation on transitional justice. I think this conversation already sets in motion those conversations. Transitional justice does not just happen in a vacuum. There is need for a national conversation. But I say that conversation is not supposed to be an elite conversation. It's supposed to be community-driven. I'm a student of Professor Johan Galtung, and Professor Johan Galtung said, let 1,000 dialogues prosper. He makes a very interesting a point there when he speaks about what he calls the gross national idea product. We are obsessed as communities with GDP, but Professor Johan Galtung says, let 1,000 dialogues prosper. And he says these need to be community-driven dialogues. He says, do not always go for the people at the top. Try it at lower levels. Grassroots people are often much more reasonable. The leaders may be leaders precisely because they have strong views, but they may also change them to keep their leadership positions. Being unpredictable, let 1,000 local dialogues among people blossom. Listen carefully for ideas. Let the GNIP, gross national idea product, grow. So that's the first thing that I put across to say we need to create and generate a national dialogue that is community-driven. The next thing is what my sister already mentioned that they are already doing, is documentation. We cannot have transitional justice in a vacuum or in a space where we don't have information. And in preparation for that process, for truth-seeking, civil society must get busy today to document whatever is happening, particularly the human rights violations that are happening, because that will influence the quality of the transitional justice process. The third thing is building community leadership. We already said, let 1,000 dialogues blossom. These 1,000 dialogues will not blossom unless we build community leadership to be able to advance transitional justice. The case of Zimbabwe is a very important case in which in 2008, we launched the Taking Transitional Justice to the People program, reached out to over 3,000 households to generate a conversation around transitional justice. And in that process, we were able to build community leadership. The fourth thing, Prof, is the role of the young people in peace building. I will not overemphasize this, but you will find this conversation, very important to young people, both as champions of the future, but also as victims of the future impact of the violations that are happening today. And finally, let me close with the fifth point of having a regional approach to transitional justice. Let us remember that we are no longer just nations or single states. We are now regional communities. As Samora Machel, the founding father of Mozambique, said, the independence of one nation does not make sense without the independence of another. And I say transitional justice in Mozambique alone does not make sense without transitional justice in Zimbabwe, transitional justice in Swaziland, in the entire regional community, because our communities are now connected. So those are the 5 things that I want to put across, that I think if we are able to do those things, we will be able to prepare a fertile ground for a most likely successful transitional justice process in Mozambique. Back to you, Prof.
Thank you very much, Barry, for taking us through and taking the concept, drawing very much on the Union TJ policy, and coming with these recommendations. And it is with these recommendations that I will invite Sister Anna Moyo. Sister Anna Moyo. You know, Zikamai has taken us through the concept, some of the processes and these recommendations and the focus. If we want to want this not to happen again. Mozambique.
Thank you.
Mozambique, as it is today, there are still significant pockets of violence. The biggest protests have ended, but there are still pockets of violence in the south, but also in central part of the country, with state-led groups, but also non-state actors engaged in violence. I mean, do you think that with this still happening, the concept of transitional justice can be applied in ways that it can help to stop violence, create an opportunity for dialogue, a dialogue that can restore the trust at various levels, community till institutions, and more importantly, help us in terms of the reforms needed for this not to happen again. Over to you, Sister Namoyo.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Prof. And thank you so much for this opportunity to also share a few reflections, basically on transitional justice for Mozambique. How does that look like? To start by answering your question, Prof, I would like to perhaps start where my brother Tsikamai Bere stopped from, and basically then come to the question that you have asked. Thank you, Tsi, for those insights. Just add on to that, particularly around the points that you made, particularly around truth and the answering the questions why, how, who, and what to inform transitional justice. I want to start from this point, Prof, and to all the participants, that the truth is really important for Mozambique. Tsi has already spoken a lot about the different pillars, or rather principles of transitional justice, this basket that we have to choose from for a country that has undergone something like Mozambique, and how it comes out of some of that, forging a path or transitioning from violence, violations, conflict, and many other occurrences that necessitate a transitional justice process towards a future of peace, or at least relative peace or democratic order. So truth is really important, and some of the reason why a country like Mozambique would need a truth-telling process, as we heard Mai speak earlier, is because truth is one of the prerequisites for reconciliation. We cannot reconcile a society or people who've been at loggerheads for a long time. We cannot reconcile ethnic groups. We cannot reconcile people who've been in different warring factions without truth. Truth helps us to at least facilitate a process that leads us to reconciliation. So truth is really important. But at the same time, in learning this truth, another key reflection that I want to bring to the table is that knowing who, knowing what, knowing how, knowing where and why is really important, because that tells us who the victims are, who the perpetrators are. Zee spoke about this earlier. But those are also the very foundations for addressing the aftermath or the consequences of conflict. If we embark on processes where we don't know who the victims are and we haven't acknowledged who the victims are, we haven't established a shared or collective truth about what happened, getting it from victims' perspectives, perpetrators' perspectives, perspectives of bystanders or witnesses, those who saw it happen, then we then risk building or undertaking a nation building process based on what we think or what we assume the truth to be. And when we leave victims behind, when we don't hold perpetrators accountable, usually we end up cultivating a culture of impunity where anyone at any stage of a country or society's existence can decide to undertake the very same process, or to start a conflict, or perhaps because of tensions or things that they're frustrated by, they then embark on violence because they know nothing will happen to them, or a country will undertake a process of negotiating a peaceful settlement where everyone is brought to the table without consulting with the victims. This spoke about nationwide consultations being important, and this is part of the very definition of transitional justice in the AU, in the African Union transitional justice policy. So when we build upon what we think or what we assume a country needs without involvement of the victims, the communities that are directly affected by conflict, usually that's where we begin to see recurrence of conflicts. This is where we begin to see other parties, when they are fed up, when their grievances are not met, then they also embark on violence. Many of our countries, and Mozambique is one, when the Frelimo Renamo civil war erupted in Mozambique, part of what was put at the table was a negotiated settlement. It didn't bring in victims or affected communities to the table. This was a political settlement that left victims outside. Even the very, I'll put in quotes, reconciliation that it facilitated was a false reconciliation, because we saw some years later the taking up of arms by one of the parties to that civil war or that conflict, again showing how delicate or how fragile that reconciliation was. Anything could trigger any of the parties to the negotiated settlement to take up arms again and go back to the bush. We've seen that happen. So truth is really important. And when we talk of reconciliation, we can't build reconciliation upon what we assume. Truth has to be established, and part of knowing the truth is to facilitate other processes. So truth really becomes also a foundation for other processes, such as reparations for victims, justice for victims, holding perpetrators accountable. So accountability processes also follow this knowledge of the truth, what happened. When we know what happened, then we are able to now have follow-on processes, transitional justice processes. Tsigamai, my brother, spoke about a number of them. All of these are within the basket of transitional justice that a country now, through a consultative process, can choose to a few of them to advance their own process of transitioning from conflict, from war, from crisis or gross human rights violations towards a more peaceful or democratic, more peaceful existence or democratic order. This is really important. Another point I want to make, Prof, is that in a country like Mozambique, part of what we have seen is that where a nation is frog-marched towards or coerced into a negotiated settlement, where victims are not part of the consultations around how do we move forward. They're not part of nation building, and it's political actors only at the table negotiating a political settlement. Usually, this becomes a recipe for disaster, particularly given that there is no buy-in from the general population or the general public, and usually what politicians negotiate at that high level is usually not sustainable. So some of those negotiated settlements tend to be short-lived, and they tend to be unsustainable, and also they tend to perpetuate a culture of impunity, where basically anyone in society will feel, okay, I can also take up arms and nothing will happen to me. At the very best, we will be all brought to the table, and I'll also have a piece of the pie, particularly in leadership or in governance of a country. So we tend to then set up very dangerous precedents when transitional justice does not become the go-to field to address the consequences of conflicts, of gross human rights violations, or even of wars like what we saw with the Frelimo Renamo civil war in the country. Another point that I want to make is that in a country like Mozambique, when we say we want to pursue a truth-telling or truth-seeking process, whose truth we are pursuing is also very important. And Zee spoke earlier about the fact that it's important to consult with basically society as a whole, and this is important. But what we have seen in most cases is that when an occurrence like what has happened, my sisters and elders spoke so eloquently about the violations that have occurred, from enforced disappearances to some of the extrajudicial killings, the torture that has taken place in the country, and many other human rights violations that have occurred. This is related to it's basically post-election violence. So usually when something like this happens, we tend to focus on this one violence or form of violence that occurs at a specific period of time. But when we are to embark on a truth-telling process for Mozambique, it's important that we don't only focus on this as a subset of violence, but we actually look at the violence that has occurred in the country. I've spoken about the Frelimo Renamo civil war in Mozambique. There was no transitional justice process to address that conflict. We have seen insurgency in the northern parts of Mozambique since 2017. There hasn't been a transitional justice process to address violent extremism or insurgency in the north, in Mozambique. Now we have this post-election violence in the country. All of these different types of violence, or all of these occurrences, have brought to the fore gross human rights violations, a lot of pain and suffering on victims, destruction of property, and a lot of other, be it civil and political rights violations, socioeconomic rights violations, and there's been a lot of environmental rights violations as well that have occurred. So if we are to say truth is important for Mozambique, then we need to look at a process that will look at what has happened in Mozambique, going as far back as the Frelimo Renamo conflict or war in the country, so that we establish truth, so that even historical victims, coming to the victims from 2017 due to insurgency and the current victims, all find expression and can express themselves and find an outlet to talk about what has happened, and so that we can then address the societal problem of violence, gross human rights violations, and recurrence of conflicts in Mozambique, in conflicts in all their different forms as they have occurred in Mozambique. So this is very important. And my brother already alluded to the African Union Transitional Justice Policy. It talks about the need for transitional justice to address historical legacies as well as some of the current occurrences. It could be democratic deficits, governance deficits, and many other types of crises that bring about gross human rights violations in a society, in a community, or in a region. So all of these are important. So if we are to look at truth, we need to basically look at truth in its entirety, vis-a-vis addressing all the different occurrences of violence, gross human rights violations, conflicts that have taken place in the country. And this is necessary because we did not have transitional justice processes to address the prior occurrences of violence and conflicts in the country. My last point, Prof, is this, basically, and this is linked to the point that I've just made. Usually, and we have seen this in a number of countries, where historical injustices or the past is not resolved properly, we tend to see that past of injustice, that past of violence and violations continuing to haunt the present. It could be the present of perhaps a democratic order that we would have achieved as a country. And it continues to pose a serious threat to any semblance of peace that we may have gained, or even the future peace that we want to strive for as a society. So it's really important that when we are looking at a truth process that can move us towards reconciliation and justice, we really look at the whole scope of what has happened in this country. Why are we here? Because in most instances, historical injustices exist as root causes or key drivers of current conflicts and current violence, and if they are not addressed together with what is happening now, we then tend to see recurrence of conflicts in the future. So transitional justice really is a pathway that Mozambique can look at and look to address some of what has happened, particularly the gross human rights violations, as well as the historical injustices that have taken place in the country. Thank you, Prof.
Thank you very much, Sister Anna Moyo. Indeed, you make it clearly that transitional justice is the pathway for Mozambique. And this brings me to Professor Mriti. Professor, you have done a lot of work on Mozambique, a lot of research. You have been pushing for this concept in Mozambique reality. How do you look at the current situation vis-a-vis the applicability of this concept, particularly on what Zika Maibera has said, that the African Union policy has a buy-in of member states. Do you see this flying in Mozambique?
Thank you very much, Professor Giano, and congratulations. I commend you on this initiative. It's very important for us as Africans to take charge of our own processes. So this is very much a welcome process, and I would like to salute all my fellow Africans and the beautiful country of Mozambique. I have fond memories of coming to Putu, Beira, Sofala province, and I thank you also, Prof. Adriano, for the partnership we've been working on peace building. Can this concept take in Mozambique? Absolutely, yes, Prof. In fact, to borrow a term from Archbishop Desmond Tutu, there would be no future without some form of transitional justice or reconciliation or process. So I would very much endorse this initiative, and I support it and wholeheartedly stand in solidarity with the people of Mozambique as they push this agenda forward. I think the speakers have covered the groundwork very, very well on transitional justice. My sister Anna and my brother Tsikamai, and our sister, the director. So I don't have to repeat what has to be said. Maybe just to focus very quickly on maybe three issues. One is to do with policy engagement, the other to do with more wider regional engagement, and then come back home to Mozambique, what the citizens can be doing already on this issue, even though there might be some challenges to move the agenda forward due to, we heard, the security forces being implicated in the atrocities that were committed from October 2024. So I think the first is to say it's good to hear that there is some progress on the political front with an MOU that has been signed between political parties. And I think this is an entry point for organizations like CDD, human rights organizations, to actually engage the parliamentarians to push for legislation that will enable the Truth and Accountability Commission that you've identified as a pathway forward. And maybe just to also say, if I take a step back to say, this is a good concept, it's a very good conceptual approach. Truth and accountability is a very broad term. So I think it's a good thing to see that Mozambique is already an indigenous, homegrown approach to this issue of truth commissions. Too often we tend to cut and paste Truth and Reconciliation Commission from other countries, and this doesn't work at all because the reconciliation is a multi-decade intergenerational process. So we will not be achieving reconciliation for the atrocities that we've seen for quite some time until we have truth and we have accountability and we have redress and we're working together on a journey towards healing. So I commend you for framing it in this way. So we will need legislation, a Truth and Accountability Act of some sort in Parliament that will be adopted to frame the whole process going forward. In the absence of that, civil society think tanks such as CDD can already do a lot of work to establish a parallel structure, their own institution. You don't have to wait for permission from the government. It sounds like you're already moving in that direction, and I commend you. You can set something up that is being run by a coalition of the willing organizations and partners. And then eventually we do have to engage government, and I will mention SADC and the African Union at a later stage. And to be able to ensure that this process, is inclusive. Some of the points made by my brother Tsikamabere are absolutely vital around community leadership, community dialogue, youth engagement, women engagement, documentation. These are all absolutely vital to ensure that we have a strong basis on knowledge analysis to engage the political actors. So I think if I can highlight the importance of political policy analysis to be undertaken by organizations such as yours, partnering with other partners, the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation in Cape Town, where I work, we support these sorts of initiatives to produce Mozambican-based analysis of the situation of what is viable, what is feasible going forward, and to provide concise guidance to the political leaders who will be framing this moving forward. So we will need research, analysis, victim survivor surveys to provide this evidence-based data that can inform policy and can also inform international partners. You heard the call for international partners to engage and regional partners to engage. This is something that already we can hit the ground running and move fairly quickly to begin to produce a number of think pieces that can begin to shape and influence the discussion going forward. So that's the one point I want to make. The other point is around the regional dimension, which often is it's a big challenge when you're struggling with your internal national crises. It's very difficult to take a step back and look across the region and to see that, in fact, our neighbors are also struggling. I'm speaking to you from Cape Town, South Africa, where the issue of transitional justice is still on the agenda after 30 years of so-called transition to democracy. The issue of the expropriation of land is now coming to the fore, and it has an international dimension, which we will not need to discuss here. And then the issue of other countries in the region also on their journey towards transitional justice processes, like Zimbabwe, as my brother Tsikamaya mentioned. Lesotho has been on the agenda, and SADC, the Southern African Development Community, has in fact recommended a transitional justice mechanism for Lesotho. A number of other countries in the region have had similar processes, are yet to even begin to think about these processes. And as we heard, if you don't deal with the impunity of violations, then they will come back to haunt you at a later stage. So the other dimension is to link the national TJ process in Mozambique to the regional level, to regional transitional justice processes. Freedom in Mozambique is meaningless without freedom in other countries. That's been the big slogan of the liberation. Transitional justice in Mozambique also has to be linked to other countries in the region. So Mozambique, TJ processes, those acting on TJ Mozambique, I think necessarily need to engage with SADC in Gaborone, African Union in Addis Ababa, and the AU-TJP unit specifically in Addis at the AU. And Prof. Adriano, I think we need to go to Gaborone and begin to engage SADC to encourage it to also interact with the political leadership. It can serve as a very useful checks and balances mechanism to ensure that there is transparency moving forward with these processes, so they don't become corrupted by the political forces that are keen to control and manipulate the outcomes of such processes. So we're talking about a regional transitional justice process, a cross-border transitional justice initiative, right? That can have a dynamic interplay with the initiatives that you are already creating in Mozambique. And to achieve this, I think you will need civil society acting in unison together, not divided, multiple agendas, multiple forums, and so on and so forth, fragmentation, but a united framework for civil society, think tanks, non-state actors, however they want to define themselves, to work together as a form of mobilization, for campaigning, advocacy, communications to the wider community of Mozambique, but also to to the regional actors as well. So I think I'm not sure if you've already established one, but a kind of a Mozambican civil society network, very much along the lines of what Zika Maibere and his colleagues established in Zimbabwe in 2008. I think something like that will be vital for Mozambique. And as I begin to conclude, I think on the issue of citizen engagement, it's absolutely vital to begin to engage citizens across the board. It's already happening on social media, I'm sure. But given the atrocities that were committed, families that are looking for loved ones that have not been found, it's important to start processes that are simple, very simple. They don't need funding. They don't need big proposals and major kind of, campaigns. And this is like memorialization processes of where people may have disappeared, where people may have fallen, where, atrocities may have been committed. A simple vigil or a small symbolic memorial can be put up to stand to represent the harm that was done. That itself is a powerful tool, right, already for engaging citizens and the wider community in discussions going forward. And I think that's where the role of the young people comes in, because they are very creative in terms of these sorts of interventions. Primary schools, secondary schools, universities, especially the universities, I think they should be taking an important role in shaping the discourse going forward, because we've seen that this Gen Z power is a very powerful source. If we utilize it and engage it and allow it to express itself, it can really help to push our countries forward. So let me perhaps stop there, Prof. Adriano, and to just say that, as I said, we stand in solidarity with all the people of the beautiful country of Mozambique, and we are looking forward to the day when we both get to that point of true freedom from any violence and atrocities, and when we can all live in peace as Africans on our beloved continent of Africa. So, muito obrigado, Prof. Adriano.
Muito obrigado, Prof, for those remarks. Indeed, Mozambique has to anchor its call for truth, for justice on regional mechanisms. The Gaborone, Ethiopia, where just recently there was this forum on AU TJ policy, and it is this point that takes me to Dr. John. You have listened to all this. You have heard what happened in Mozambique in terms of the collapse of the rule of law, the lawlessness that we witnessed here in Mozambique, where not only state forces, like different units of the police, but also state-centric death squads deployed to target those who were perceived as behind the demonstrations, which is still ongoing, but also non-state actors were involved in violence. So there was a sense of lawlessness, a sense of the collapse of the rule of law. There is now government in place, the same government in place. So the question most people ask is whether it is possible. We have taken the example of South Africa, where the truth and reconciliation was possible because the apartheid regime had fallen. So it was a transition. Zika Maibere unpacked that to make a clear distinction that transitional justice is not the same with regime change. In fact, it's not the same philosophically, theoretically, conceptually, and practically it is not the same. But in South Africa, it was possible because of the situation there. Mozambique, it is different, and violence is still ongoing. So what can we get from Ethiopia? What can we get from the African Union to navigate this call for truth, this call for justice, this call for reconciliation, and the reform that is much needed so that this will not happen again? Doctor, over to you. Tell us, when this violence was happening, people were asking, where is the African Union? Today, you are in the room. Tell us, Doctor, what?
No, thank you very much, Professor. Let me first start on this note by appreciating the organizers of this very important meeting for inviting the African Union to be part of this discussion. And also let me start by saying that having listened to eminent experts in the field of transitional justice, those that have spoken, some spoke, excellently well about the African Union transitional justice policy, and they came up with excellent recommendations on the way forward with regard to Mozambique situation. But permit me, I will just narrow my intervention to 3 issues. One, I will talk a little bit about the background, to the African Union transitional justice policy, and also the provisions and how this provision can assist Mozambique with regard to its agenda on transitional justice, and finally, what the African Union and the African Union transitional justice policy can offer to Mozambique with regard to transitional justice. First, let me start from this background point of view, that human rights violations in conflicts, electoral-related human rights abuses, and human rights oppression by authoritarian regime are some of the prevailing, characteristics of African political experiences. And if you also look at what is currently happening in countries like DRC, Sudan, South Sudan, Libya, and particularly the Kenya 2007 electoral violence, which is very similar to that of the Mozambique experience, are some of the scenarios, are some of the experiences that we have witnessed on the continent. And it was in this context, among other explanations, that the African Union began its intervention right from a long time ago on different aspects of transitional justice across the continent. And some of this intervention, for example, include promotion of peace and security, promotion of democratization, justice and accountability, national reconciliation, national integration, truth-telling in post-conflict environment. And this is the reason why we say that transitional justice is a multidisciplinary, it's a multidisciplinary discipline, where it is not just about accountability alone, but it is also about accountability. It is also about institutional reform. It is about the victims, and it is a multidimensional, discipline that we need to understand. And that is very important for me to emphasize this point right from the outset, that there is a need for a balanced narrative of transitional justice. When we don't come with a balanced narrative on transitional justice, at times, from our own experience as African Union, member states tend to shy away when you just lay claim, you are looking at transitional justice from a narrow perspective of accountability alone. When some of the member states, the ruling parties, the government, when they see that you are coming with this perspective alone, they tend to shy away. And so one advice is that the Mozambique approach should be a balanced approach with regard to intervention on transitional justice. Having emphasized this important point, let me also start by saying that from 2007 to 2010, the African Union Panel of the Wise, one of the pillars of the African peace and security architecture, carried out a research on transitional justice And the research led to a publication titled Non-Impunity, Truth, Justice, and Reconciliation in 2011. And one of the recommendations of this research by the panel of the wise was that African Union has been supporting its member states in different ways on issues of transitional justice. But unfortunately, there is no one comprehensive policy document that details how the Africans should approach transitional justice. And that was what led to the development of the African Union Transitional Justice Policy, which was adopted in 2019. And all the speakers have alluded, particularly my brother Zinkamai has talked a lot about the provisions of the African Union Transitional Justice Policy and how it will help us also in Mozambique. But having said that, the policy is divided into 4 sections. I will just briefly talk about this and some of the sections that will be very relevant to the work that Mozambique is currently doing. This section 1 deals with the introduction. It also covers the goal, objective, the rationale, the principles of the African Union Transitional Justice Policy. But I think it's very important for me to emphasize here, particularly the principles that underpin the African Union Transitional Justice Policy, so that we are able to differentiate the principles and also from the pillars, which we refer to as indicative elements in the African Union Transitional Justice Policy. The first principle is that its African Transitional Justice Program should be African-led. It should be led by the people of Africa. You also talk about the national and local ownership. I think one of the speakers has alluded to that it should be people's-led, people's-driven. It should be nationally owned and not externally driven and owned. Inclusivity, equity, and non-discrimination are part of the principles that the African Union also emphasizes. Context specificity to avoid paste and cut and paste. Yes, we have heard so much about the South Africa experience. Yes, but when you look at what we have had over time now, during this presentation, you will see that the context differs from what happened in South Africa. And so the ideas of cut and paste will not be ideal for Mozambique in time of transitional justice. So the context specificity is very, very important. And we also have others like due regard for gender and generation dimension, in other words, the youth participation and the rest of them, which some of the speakers have also alluded to. Sequencing, balancing of transitional justice element are some of the principles that should underpin, which I believe Mozambique needs to learn and also borrow from this principle. The second section deals with indicative element of transitional justice for Africa. I believe many of us were aware, most often the United Nations and the European Union transitional justice framework always emphasize 4 pillars, mainly on truth-seeking, justice and accountability, reparation, and institutional reform and guarantee of non-recurrence. But if you look at the pillar of the African Union Transitional Justice Policy, it is very broad in the sense that it takes into consideration the African peculiar context by ensuring that the elements or the pillars that we have cover virtually the situations with regard to transitional justice, accountability, national reconciliation on the continent. So it has about 11 pillars. The first one, which is also very important and relevant to Mozambique, is the peace process. In other words, the situation in Mozambique currently is that conflict is still going on. Human rights violation is still going on. There is a need for a peace agreement. There is a need to put an end to this conflict so that there will be peace agreement that will be in place. And from our own experience as African Union, particularly what happened in Ethiopia, we have been able to realize that peace process is very fundamental. It is an avenue to incorporate transitional justice into the process. And that was the experience that we had with the government of Ethiopia and the Tigray region when they signed the peace agreement in South Africa. The African Union utilized that opportunity to ensure that, provision for transitional justice is incorporated into the peace agreement, taking reference and making reference to the African Union Transitional Justice Policy for them to adhere to the principles and also learn and also borrow from the indicative element. The second pillar is what is referred to as the Truth Commissions. And I think we have talked so much about the Truth Commission, which is also very important and will be also useful for the government of Mozambique to take into consideration this in its transitional justice program. Others include African Traditional Justice Mechanism. In other words, a mixture of the former justice mechanism and traditional justice mechanism might also be helpful. Then we have others like reparation, which I believe will be very useful for the Mozambique experience. We have others like retributive justice, socio-economic justice, memorialization. Diversity management is also another principal pillars that I believe will be very useful for the Mozambique. The other ones includes justice and accountability. But like I said, it is very important that there is a balanced narrative, because our experience, for example, whether in Ethiopia, whether in South Sudan, when you dwell and focus too much without balancing transitional justice narrative, you focus too much on accountability, member states tend to shy away. And so it's very important balance the narrative and touch on all pillars that will be useful for Mozambique. The other pillar that will be very relevant has to do with political and institutional reforms, because when you look at some of these police that we have been talking about, some of these state apparatus that have been violating human rights, there is need for reform of some of these institutions and political structures. Human and people's rights are also one of the pillars that is very fundamental that we need to take care of. Others, the section 3 of the policy talk about cross-cutting issues like women and girls, the youth, children, person with disability, IDPs, stateless person, and older person. In other words, what this cross-cutting issue is trying to do is to make sure that transitional justice process is all-inclusive, taking into consideration different diversity that make up the society. You know, the marginalized, all must be involved in the process. And the fourth section of the policy talk about actors, processes, implementation. And this segment is also very important, because when you look at it at the national level, regional level, continental level, there are different actors, like, for example, the role of the African Union, the role of the regional economic community, and also the role of the non-state actors, like what you are doing, the CDD and other partners, what currently doing now. The African Union Transitional Justice Policy has extensive and comprehensive provisions on the roles of different actors, including individuals, regional organization, continental organization, and civil society organization. And so if we are able to look at the roles, the African Union Transitional Justice Policy, it has so many provisions that will help Mozambique in its course for adoption, development, and implementation of its transitional justice program. Now, what can African Union Transitional Justice Policy and the African Union offer Mozambique at this particular context with regard to transitional justice? The first one is that Mozambique could embrace and key into the various provisions, relevant provisions of the African Union Transitional Justice Policy to unveil the truth and also promote national peace, reconciliation, justice, accountability, and also the strengthening of the Mozambique national human rights system, which is currently weak now. So this is one of the areas where the Mozambique can key into the policy and also seek support from the African Union. The second one is that under the non-state actors, CDD, ICTJ, and Professor Moriti's organization, and so many other organizations like the Zimbabwe non-state organization dealing with the issues of human rights, can also team together with other national human rights, and also civil society organizations to advocate and promote Mozambique embracement of transitional justice development and implementation. That is the second one. Mozambique government can also request for technical assistance from the African Union and regional economic community like SADC for support to the development and implementation of its transitional justice program. And in this area, for example, we got requests from countries like Ethiopia, countries like South Africa, countries like DRC, Lesotho is the latest one that made a request that we are currently supporting. So this is also what the advocacy that can be carried out for the government to make official requests from the government, from the African Union, for us to be able to provide such support. In addition to that, Mozambique can also utilize the African Union Transitional Justice Policy to develop its own transitional justice policy and mechanisms. And we have seen some countries that have done this. Ethiopia is a very good example. Gambia is another very good example. And also when you look at the 2 new laws that has just been adopted by the South Sudan, they borrow a lot, from the African Union Transitional Justice Policy. And I believe Mozambique can also follow this process and also learn from the African Union through its program and also the policy. Now, in a nutshell, for me to now round up, what should be the role? Is the role of the African Union in TJ processes for Mozambique to be able to learn? One is the development of a continental transitional justice policy for members' use and adoption. That has been our role. The AUTJP is now a document that is readily available for any member state, including Mozambique, to go through, study properly, and contextualize the provision for the Mozambique to be able to come up with its own policy and mechanism to deepen human rights respect and also promote justice and accountability in the country. The second one, which I have also talked about, is technical support to member state implementing transitional justice. We have been very active in this area, and we are also very much ready. What we just need to from the government of Mozambique is a request from the Ministry of Justice that they need the African Union support, and the African Union will swing in along this line. In addition to that, partnering with civil society organizations to promote TJ implementation in member states. As you may be aware, we have been working with IGR, we have been working with CSVR in some of our member states, including Ethiopia and also in Lesotho. So I believe that the civil society organization has critical role, and we can mobilize resources and, explore the network for us to be able to join hands together with the African Union for us to provide the requisite technical assistance to Mozambique with regards to transitional justice. Another thing which is also very important is that the African Union has been convening a continental dialogue to shape transitional justice discourse and implementation on the continent. And if you take a look at some of our recommendations in the report that we have been having on our annual Transitional Justice Forum, there are different recommendations that will also help Mozambique in the implementation, in the conceptualization and implementation of its transitional justice mechanism and program. The other one is mainstreaming transitional justice in peace agreement. And I think this is very important. The civil society like CDD and other stakeholders has critical role to play in this regard, that any peace agreement, any memorandum of understanding that is being put in place now or that will be put in place, one of the things that we must campaign for is the integration and mainstreaming of transitional justice, so that all these good things that all the speakers have talked about, respect for human rights, justice, accountability, national integration, and all the rest of them will be then carried out under the transitional justice program, under the peace agreement or be it memorandum of understanding. Finally, one thing that I will also want to say is that for us as African Union, we have been working seriously with the regional economic community. And if you look at it now, the regional economic community like ECOWAS, IGAD, and also SADC, they have borrowed a lead from the African Union work on transitional justice. These countries, this regional economic community are now developing their own transitional justice instrument using the African Union Transitional Justice Policy. Just the way they are using this policy to develop their own framework, I believe Mozambique can also borrow lessons and also use the African Union Transitional Justice Policy to develop its own policy and also mechanism. Not only that, we have been working with experts, even among these speakers that we have. Some of the speakers that we have today now are some of our technical experts that are also supporting these regional economic communities and member states, providing technical assistance on the development of their own transitional justice and mechanism. So I believe that this platform is a formidable platform that we can explore further after this discussion conference, where we can come together to begin to share ideas on how we can provide the necessary support to Mozambique on the development and implementation of its transitional justice mechanism. Because of time, I think I will just stop at this end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. John, for taking us through what can offer. And it is clear, depending on the political will from the Mozambique government and this and the various other actions that we are considering are part of raising awareness within the society, advocating the government to kind of consider while in tandem, as Professor Rita suggested, that we take some of the societal driven mechanisms to push for truth, to push for reconciliation, because one of the key issues for Mozambique today, key issues in relation to what has happened is, number one, violence has not yet stopped. This is number one issue. Violence has not yet stopped. Though the widespread protests have stopped, but violence, targeted violence, not yet stopped. People are being targeted, people are being killed by state and non-state actors. And there is a sense of lawlessness, sense of the breaking of the rule of law. And today we have the presidential candidate summoned to the public prosecutor. And the people are rallying to support him. So we continue to witness actions that are not conducive to that environment where an inclusive dialogue could take place, which is the necessary and crucial step to end violence at the moment, and then to lead into the much broad TJ processes for justice in the country. With this in mind, but taking into consideration that, as Anna Moyo clearly said, we had a 1992 peace agreement without provisions for transitional justice. Because of that, we had low-intensity civil war continuing. We needed 2 more peace agreements so that subsequent elections could take place. And today, as I've indicated to you, we saw last week the government signing the peace. It's a memorandum of understanding for dialogue, but it is not inclusive, no TJ provisions. Colleagues, friends, taking into account this context, do you see TJ flying in Mozambique? Because we have waves and waves of injustices, of impunity, people disappearing for decades and decades, and elite-centric agreements not doing justice to the people, to the extent that today we witness community-level lawlessness, killings like they are killing chicken. How do you see, what could be the entry points for that? This is my question to all of you, to Zenalda Machado, to Dzika Maibere, to Anna Moyo, Professor Mriti, and to Dr. John. 3.5 minutes for each of you to take us through what could be the entry points for that. I will start with Zenalda Machado. Zenaldo is still preparing. I will go to Zeka Maibere.
Thank you very much, Prof. I think the entry point is exactly where we are, this conversation that CDD has organized. And I think it presents a good opportunity for us to begin to scale up. Remember the first area that I mentioned in terms of saying this process is complicated. And how do we prepare a fertile ground for it to succeed? So I think we are right at the right place in terms of entry point. I called community-driven national conversation on transitional justice. And I think from there, we now need to expand that conversation and heed the advice of the great Johann Galtung, who said, "Let 1,000 dialogues blossom." And I think that's a very good entry point in the leadership that CDD is providing.
Thank you very much. Let 1,000 community dialogues flourish. That is a powerful statement. That is a powerful paradigm to have decentralized, community-centric dialogues without interferences of the big players that tend to use those space for the perpetuation of the status quo, rather than engaging in transformative sort of dialogues. Sister Anna Moyo, what's your take? I think she's still preparing.
Yes.
Okay, Sister Anna Moyo.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Prof, for that question. Also, basically building upon my brother Tsikamai's comment, I really think that it's possible. One of the pillars or the indicative elements of transitional justice in the African Union transitional justice policy is peace, basically. And it's possible to bring everyone to the table. And I think a national dialogue does exactly that, where as part of the agreement or the arrangement is that all parties, all violence ceases for a moment as we all come together at a dialogue table to discuss a way forward, a nation building process that is essential, that will be effective to move everyone forward. So I think that can be undertaken. But building upon my brother's point that 1,000 dialogues or consultative processes need to happen. If you look at the history of South Africa, it was still during apartheid when the first CODESA was hosted in the country. Not everyone had put down tools. There was still a lot of violence that was still happening. Pockets of violence were happening in different communities in South Africa. But that national arrangement, that calling for a peaceful process, a process that brought about different actors, multiple stakeholders together to map a way forward for a country, was a catalyst for South Africa undertaking or deciding to undergo a truth and reconciliation process in order to deal with the consequences of apartheid era violations and address apartheid, the system of apartheid in South Africa. So even though violence is still happening, at least at a political level, we need political will. And I think what you spoke about, Prof, earlier, that there has been a signing of a memorandum towards establishing a national dialogue is the very political will that we need. Now the role is for everyone in Mozambique, the international community, the supporters of and friends of Mozambique, to now also become part and parcel of this process as a civil society, to also lend a hand to Mozambique as they embark on this very ambitious agenda in these uncertain times where violence is still continuing, but at the very least, at a political level, there has been some movement towards starting a process. This is a process to latch onto, to literally leverage as an entry point towards pushing a transitional justice agenda. So I think it's possible, and this is a very crucial entry point that we can all galvanize along and mobilize community members, victim groups, a lot of stakeholders from faith-based institutions, community-based institutions, traditional leaders, and any other stakeholder in Mozambique towards bringing in their views and also being part and parcel of designing a way forward, a nation-building process for Mozambique.
Thank you so much, Sister. Indeed, the signing of the MOU between the government and the political parties, it can be used. You're absolutely right. It has to be inclusive, taking into account not only non-state actors, civil society and other stakeholders, but more importantly, bringing in the victims, the voices of the victims. They have to influence that process in ways that it serves also the need that they have at a community level for justice. That is a point well taken. Professor Tim Mrit.
Yes, sir. So basically, there is no choice. There is no choice for Mozambique going forward. The reason why the violence keeps coming to the surface, and Zenalda Machado actually did an excellent expose explaining that the violence that we saw in October is not new violence. It's a repackaged form of violence that comes from the past. And it will keep coming back. And the next time it might be worse. This violence goes back not only to the War of 92 and the peace agreement. And it's interesting, after that agreement in Mozambique, in the 90s, in the early 90s, there was no transitional justice process. Well, there were few. There was the reintegration of children, child soldiers, using indigenous approaches to healing. But there was no national process that was anchored, that was widespread, with 1,000 dialogues, as Zekamaya has informed us, needs to happen. So there was, because everything was swept under the carpet, and we thought everything was peaceful, it has now come to the surface. But it goes beyond the 90s, it goes to the struggle for liberation in Mozambique, to the Frelimo Renamo battle, to the destabilization of the apartheid state of Mozambique, to the role of the international actors in destabilizing the country. Those divisions exist up till today, and they haven't really gone away. What you've seen is a repackaging of the role players, but it's the same battle, it's the same conflict. And we haven't even brought in Cabo Delgado in the north, where the socio-economic exclusion and marginalization of those communities is also fueling violence. So this is not only something that we should be thinking about in Mozambique, but this is something we should be thinking about for the whole of Mozambique. The whole of Mozambique, and going back in time. The Kenyan Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission report identified the British colonialists as people that need to account for the atrocities that happened during the colonial era, and have identified a number of processes that need to be taken into action. The so-called the Mau Mau Liberation Freedom Fighters, the Kenyan Land and Freedom Army, went to London and successfully received a settlement out of court because the British government did not want the process to go through the courts for the violations that they endured as members of the Mau Mau. So the Mozambican story cannot move forward without going into its past history and dealing with all of the compounded violations across the whole country. It's not a question of if this idea of transition can catch fire or light a flame. In fact, transitional justice is about the human being. It's about human suffering, human harm. Where human beings have suffered, you have to have redress. You have to repair the relationship. You have to heal, and you have to, where possible, compensate, restitute, reform, so on and so forth. So it's forget about the concept of transitional justice. It's just the way we are framing it right now. But if you don't do it as human beings, this violence is going to come back. So I think, given where we are today, and given the fact that we have such dynamic leaders like yourself, Prof. Adriano, and Zenalda, to take this process forward, I think it's in good hands. We are standing in solidarity with you. You've heard from the African Union. They are also by your side, so we can move this process forward. There will be obstacles. There will be pushback. There will be political attempts to control the process. But I think it's important, nevertheless, to continue on the journey. Because, as I said, we have no option. It's not a choice. It's not a question of choice. Many actors think it's a question of a choice, but this is not really one of a choice. It is a decision that determines the extent of peace in Mozambique going forward. Thank you, Prof. Adriano.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Indeed, solidarity is our currency, and Mozambique has no choice. TJ is the way to go. It's the way to go to ensure that there is truth, there is accountability, there is reparations, and there is healing. People need to heal. And memorialization is part of that process. Accepting that this happened and do a bit of justice for people. You are right, Prof. TJ is about human beings. It's about treating people with dignity. That's why we're here. Dr. John, entry points for Mozambique, your take, final comments. We are 4 minutes before the assigned time to come to an end. Please. Okay. While he's preparing, I would like to take this opportunity to thank all of you, our distinguished panelists, our distinguished guests, our participants, for making time for this conversation today. It's a conversation about truth, accountability, dialogue, and reform in Mozambique, a country that is so beautiful. But it has history of violence followed by impunity, followed by impunity. So it's not only violence that is hurting people, but it's the impunity, the lack of acknowledgement of what happened, justice for the people, bit of reparation to allow reconciliation to happen. That has never happened. You travel across this country, you see no memory. For example, of the 1.1 million people killed during the Civil War. Not a single memory for those people. So there is no acknowledgement. And when violence erupted in parts of the Nyambane, northern of Gaza, some people started to think that some of that violence, it is a manifestation of long historically aggrieved communities that did not have an opportunity to engage constructively in TJ processes for healing, collectively healing. So when repression from the police takes place, it goes back to where communities were left that have never seen the light of justice. This is what we are trying to do in this space. It's a beginning of a journey. We are working collaboratively with CSV partners, with Institute of TJ based in Cape Town, and other partners, the African Defenders, African Union, and other partners, with the aim of establishing a much broader coalition of players, civic-driven, that will push for TJ in Mozambique. This time, we have to say, we have seen a lot. A lot has happened that we have to do something about it, so that through that we can say this never again, never of post-election violence again, never of lawlessness again. But that is possible if we not only engage in TJ, but more importantly, we take it to the level of much needed reform. And the MOU signed by the president and political parties, it can be used as an important entry point. We'll advocate for that, while at the same time, we keep these efforts led by civil society to advocate for TJ, for Mozambique, for the people, for communities. I would like to thank you, all of you, for making the time to be here, for your contributions, for your input. We will we'll produce a report of this initial webinar that will be shared with you with clear recommendations, and we will keep you informed of the subsequent activities that we will take as part of this process. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank also the interpreter and the technical people who facilitated this meeting. Thank you all. Thank you, and see you next time. Bye-bye.